And thanks very much, Laura and Rachel, for that that warm welcome. It's great. Please come in. Okay. It's great, isn't it? It feels like that we're here after getting the news yesterday that we've all been waiting for since the summer. Isn't that Francis Quinn won Great British Bake Off, yeah? And not Sulky Ruby. Are people with me on this sort of thing? Did people see it last night? Yes, yeah, we're there. This is the really important news. Although their big pieces, the big wedding cakes last night, they were a bit disappointing, weren't they? I felt like a parent, you know, when your child brings you one of those sort of drawings from school and you go, oh, that's lovely. So yes, but so some good news. What I'm going to do today is just set a bit of sort of context around this sort of issue in the NHS. I want to start with a sort of macro picture and then just look down at some of the sort of retirement issues that we're facing as well. But first of all, just as a sort of shouting out, does anyone know how much we spend in the NHS each year? Anyone know how much we spend? Anyone shout a figure?
90 billion.
Someone reluctant, it's a bit like, 9 million, someone say?
90 billion.
19 million?
Billion.
13 billion? Higher, lower? Higher? Any?
85 billion.
85 billion? 110 billion, 110 billion, there we go. It's one of those sorts of things, really, mentioning the birthday parties. I could hear people there say millions, squillions. And it's one of those sorts of things, really, isn't it? It's about when we sort of look at millions and billions, that we can sort of lose context of it. So what's your name, sir?
John Dobson.
John Dobson, who's just eating his biscuit. That was a perfect timing for me. So if John had won the lottery and won £1 million, which you've not, this is not one of those sort of surprise things, just so that you know. If he won £1 million and I was paying him out at a pound a second, so £1, £2, £3, how long before he gets his £1 million? A million seconds. It's like masterminding here. So how long in maybe say days? So £1 million. I'm going 11 days. Okay, so 11 days later, you're a millionaire. You've got £1 million. If it was £1 billion, how long do I need to stand here for?
Oh, do you?
There you go.
Sure, not fine.
So no one expected a maths lesson this morning, did they? It's 3.5 years. Someone's saying 32 years. So just the context of £1 million and £1 billion. Different sort of coming in. So that's one of the sort of bits of context setting in terms of the money that we have around the NHS. Does anyone know how many staff work in the NHS?
1.4 million.
According to the Daily Mail this morning, half of them. It's 1.3 million staff. So you're right, £110 billion that we've got in the NHS, about 1.3 million staff that work in the NHS in England, and we have this sort of efficiency challenge of something like about a £20 billion, which I'm sort of going to come on to. But I work at NHS employers. You may see the sorts of things that we do. So the stuff in the newspapers, in the media, that sort of thing, tends to focus on things like pay or industrial action or pensions sorts of issues. But we're also there to provide what we would call good people management practice. So we genuinely believe that if we manage people well in the NHS, we get better patient care. So lots of our activity is around that issue, from managing sickness absence to health and well-being programs, to what a good occupational health department looks like, to return to work discussions, to how to write a reference to CRB checks. And we get about 180,000 visits a month to the website, so people looking at that sort of issues. So the stuff about how we look after our staff is really important to the job of work that we do. And we want to try and do that by being this sort of authoritative voice around the sort of workforce issues in the NHS. So because we've got information, because we've got sort of research, because we've got our finger on the pulse of what people are saying, we can speak authoritatively. So these sorts of events, in terms of big conversations sort of coming up and us getting information, really important to how we do our job of work. So that's a little bit of who we are. This is something about the financial challenge in the NHS. I just want to sort of put in a sort of context, because those figures are big, but what does it mean? So if we've got £110 billion, and I've just done my exercise here, what that means. Why is there a financial problem in the sort of NHS that people are talking about all the time? And here's why, really. So if we go back sort of 10 or 15 years or so, the money coming into the NHS has been coming in over and above the rate of inflation. So that chart is showing it's over and above. And if we go back, it's been something like about 5-6% in real terms growth that we've had coming in. Now, interestingly, that's what we've spent, and that's what's happened to activity. So if we go back to something like 97, it was about £35 billion coming into the NHS. now £110 billion. So just to give you a context of that sort of growth. But also our activity has gone up. So almost on any measure you look at, you'll see that activity in the NHS has gone up, whether you're looking at GP appointments or 999 calls or people coming into A&E. So our demand for services has gone up. We know going forward that that's what's going to be happening to the money. So depending on which of the commentators that you believe, but round about the rate of inflation, give or take in that way, but pretty much flat compared to where it was. And we know if we do nothing, what will happen to our spend and our activity is that. Okay, so it will just keep on going up. And that gives us a problem over here, which is a twofold problem. One, there's a cash gap. Inflation in the NHS is generally higher than background inflation. So things like drug costs, pay costs, PFI charges, those sorts of things tend to be more than the rate of inflation. That gives us a cash gap coming in. And then we have this sort of productivity gap. You know, how with the same resources can we be doing more work? And you can adjust that depending on what we do. If we can, adjust demand in some way, then the sort of productivity challenge comes down a little bit. If we can do something on the cash side, so we've recently had pay freezes, for example, and that has held some of the cash down. But effectively, we've got this big gap, which gives us this sort of £20 billion problem. And again, if you sort of project that forward, people are now talking about £30 billion sort of coming in. So I put that in the sort of context of saying, you know, this is an urgent challenge that's sort of facing the NHS. We've got to address this in some way. Politicians have got to be looking about what does that mean. And I think that most people are saying it's going to mean that we significantly change the way that we deliver services. If we look at it in those sorts of contexts. And what I'm saying is that this is an urgent problem, but an important problem as part of that is that with an ageing workforce, how are we going to sort of take that into account as well as we redesign and look at services as well. So, you know, something doesn't get the sort of headlines. People talk about changing services and the challenge that will be, but how do we do it with a workforce of 1.3 million people whose life expectancy is increasing, whose issues about their retirement age is sort of changing? What does that mean for the job of work that they do? And I'm going to sort of unpack some of that in this sort of context here. So someone said to me, that's a really interesting graph to understand. But could you could you explain how the sort of rest of the challenges facing the public sector sort of play out? So given that sort of works in the NHS in that way, and this is one of fairly straightforward. That's, yeah, as once you understand that, you're there. And I was speaking to Mike this morning when he came in. I stole that slide from Mike when I was in the Northwest, and I'm still using it because every presentation I think deserves that. Now there is a point. That I know at some point during the course of today as we're having lunch and that, someone will come up to me and say, that was a lovely presentation. Would you mind sending me your slides? I know that you only want that slide, okay? You've got no interest at all in anything else that I'm saying. So look, cut it out, just say, can you send me that slide and we'll send it across to you. Okay, and the other thing I should say is, I know that Rachel has said about keeping your phones on silent, but some of the sorts of things we're discussing about sort of age, it's really important we get it sort of, I think, into the consciousness of people going. So feel free to get your phones out and sort of, you know, if you pick up something during the course of today, put it on Twitter, you know, take a picture, take a comment, sort of get that out on Twitter into that sort of ether out there, because that's the way we start a debate around this sort of issue with a broader population than the people in this room that might be interested in it. How do we get more people interested in this issue? So, if that's a bit of sort of context setting about some of the bigger challenges that we face, some of the urgent stuff that we've got, I want to deal with some of the important stuff as well. So, just with your neighbour, just 2 or 3 questions to answer. So, what's the state retirement age? What's the NHS retirement age? Average life expectancy, and what was life expectancy for someone born in 1960? So, just have a quick chat, and then we'll see what we can test your knowledge on this sort of issue. Okay, let's have a look what you've come up with. Let's see what you've come up with. Let's see. Well, they're clearly not simple answers. Lots of debate and discussion in the room. So, what about state retirement age?
It's different for men and for women.
Different for men and women. What do you get it as?
I think for a lady it's 62.
Right.
Currently, but it's changing.
Right.
For a man, I think it's 65, but it's changing.
Right. Any advance on that? 65, 62?
There is no state retirement age.
No state retirement age? Yeah. What? Explain that, sir.
Well, the mandatory retirement has been banned.
Yeah.
So there's no mandatory retirement. You may be referring to the state pension
Pension age, yes, yeah.
And that is the age at which you may take your state pension.
Yes. So for those of us that work in HR, so we've got this thing where there was the normal sort of expectation that people would retire at 65, and he's had that conversation with them a few years ago. That sort of changed, and people could stay on. Does anyone know what the average age that people retire is in the NHS? 62. There's a poster outside there. Someone spotted it. You see, I can see someone's been wandering around on there. Okay. What about NHS retirement age? What's your age that you can get your retirement pension in the NHS? Depends on your profession. So, yeah. So protect salary status for nurses, 55. Yeah. Anything else? Any advance?
Can collect after 50, I think.
Can collect it after 50. You can sort of go and get your pension early after 50. So with an actuarial reduction. Somebody else saying something here?
It depends on the section of the pension scheme.
Right, okay, it depends when you sort of came in, yeah. So there was something about people that after 2008 changes, the retirement age moved up to 65, so we're going to look at some of those things. What about life expectancy? So what was life expectancy? So someone born in 1960, which would have been about 25 years ago before I was born, I think. But someone born in, what was it then, and what was someone born today? What's the difference?
That's not what you're asking.
Yeah, okay, what was it? Ask the question. So what's...
You're asking how long in 1960, so people who are already alive, how long they were expected to live.
Right, and what would it have been?
Which we thought was maybe about 62.
62 or something like that, okay. Yeah. Any advances on that?
72.
Yeah. I just had a look yesterday into this, and it is the way I phrased the question. So someone that was born in 1960 was 68. Someone that's born sort of today will be about 78. So 10 years sort of going. And you're probably right. So in 1960 it would have been less than that sort of thing. And it changes.
It changes as you get older.
Changes. Yeah.
The reasons that your life expectancy is younger is because some people will die, unfortunately, before they get anywhere.
Yeah. So people could live long. So the older you get, the longer that you live. Yeah. Yes. So okay. So just some questions to try and get the juices flowing around this issue. So why are we talking about this issue? So just a bit of background. People recall not long after this government came into power that they asked Lord Hutton, who was a previous sort of Labour minister, to have a look at this sort of pension age issue and to come up with some sort of recommendations that were sort of affordable and fair sort of coming in. So we made some sort of recommendations about linking NHS pension age with state retirement age, and also about moving from a final salary scheme into a career averaging scheme. We had some sort of discussions with the trade unions around this thing and came up with a sort of heads of terms around this issue that brought those changes into account. So we had done some changes in 2008 that changed the retirement age from 60 to 65 as a normal retirement age in the NHS. So we had two sort of schemes operating, and then we've reached heads of terms which change the schemes now. And again, sort of changes around this is this move from a final salary into a career averaging scheme, and also that the NHS retirement age is linked to the state retirement age, so the age at which you retire. And I'll sort of come on to that. So before, we discussed the pensionable age or retirement age. Before, state pension age was nothing to do with when you would retire from the NHS. Sort of coming through. Those things are now linked. Okay, in terms of when you get access to your pensions, and again, more complicated than that. So looking at some of the changes that have taken place. So I guess these are one of those sorts of things, just from the debate in the room, that we could have done 6 or 7 slides on about the various sorts of combinations, but just some of the sorts of headlines around this. So people born between the 6th of April 60 and 5th of March 61 will now have a phased retirement age between 66 and 67. Born after 1961, it will be 67, and then there will be increases. So the state retirement age will increase to something like 68, to 68, somewhere between 2044 and 2046, sort of coming through. And now, part of this stuff is, because that seems a long way away, sort of 30 years away, what's the extent to which this is, people are thinking about it. But for us, and part of having this sort of conversation now is that this is one of those sorts of important issues. It might not be the sorts of things affecting people next week, but the sort of thing that we need to get right, particularly in the context of the changes that we're going to have to see. And it's not been easy to get there. So those of you that have been around in the NHS will know that about a year and a half ago, we had a industrial action with most NHS staff. In fact, it was 2 years ago, last November, with NHS staff that went on strike around this issue, and then about 6 months later in the June, we had the first strike of doctors for something like 40 years around this issue. But the changes have been brought in, and we're now sort of introducing those. As part of that, they also increased the premiums that individuals were paying. So premiums going up for individuals in that case as well. So not only retirement ages, but of course there was a lot of debate and discussion around, can people in the NHS work safely and effectively up to the age of 68? So that's one of the sorts of things that sort of came out of that. So when we brought the changes in, there are some staff that are protected, so that those that were in 10 years of their NHS retirement age weren't affected by those changes, and there was some sort of transitional and phasing arrangements. But effectively, we've got something like up to 70% of the workforce have now got a pension age somewhere between 65 and 68. So anyone, for example, that started into the NHS pension scheme after those 2008 changes, it would have been 65. I'm in that sort of transition gap between. I wasn't quite within 10 years of the retirement age, so I'll have a combination of sort of final salary and moving on to different phases. But effectively, we've got this sort of 70%. Now the age is moving on, depending on the date of birth. And again, this could increase in the future if the government changes those retirement ages. So because we've got that link, there's now a link made between what we've got. So this was one of the sorts of things that, in terms of the trade unions, were uncomfortable with. So when we're having this sort of discussions about this, I think it's fair to say that they were reasonably comfortable with the idea of saying, if we need to change the retirement age, let's have a discussion about what that might mean. Is it 66? Is it 67? Is it 68? What should that be? But one of the sorts of things is this link, which is very sort of difficult on a negotiating point of view, because effectively what we've got is an agreement that says, well, if the government changes the retirement age, all your pension ages changes. And so from a trade union point of view, you can understand the sort of reluctance to sort of enter into an agreement that somebody else can sort of change the parameters or the dynamic of that. So it's one of the sort of issues in the debate, but that link has now been established in there. And then just something about the demography of the NHS workforce. So that 1.3 million people that we've got. Look around the room. Does anyone know what the average age of the NHS worker is at the moment? 47? Higher, lower? 50? 43, sort of coming through? Yeah. So it's something like, it's about 42.7 or something like that, the average age at the moment. By 2023, that will rise to 47. And we have a third of the workforce nationally, a third of the workforce are over 50. So what we've got is the NHS workforce ageing sort of coming through. So we've got that sort of issue coming through. So living longer and a workforce that's ageing in that regard. So one of the sorts of things, as part of the heads of terms that we reached in this final solution on the pensions, we said we want to look at this issue of what that means in terms of working longer. So we've set up a, if you like, a tripartite review. So it's NHS employers representing employers, trade unions, and the Department of Health that said let's have a review and see what this means. Because when we're having the discussions around this, lots of sort of anecdotal evidence around it. So I, as an employer, would say, I can sort of understand some of the concerns, but we've got staff all the time over 65 wanting to stay on in work and do that very sort of effectively, sort of coming in. And trade unions would say, and I think fairly so, that's all very well if they want to, but what about if they have to? In terms of, what does that sort of mean? And is that the same for everybody? So just because we're living longer doesn't mean we are fitter and healthier. What are those sorts of issues? So we wanted to get that sort of review done in a tripartite way with a view of producing some sort of recommendations to the Department of Health in December of this year. And these are the sorts of things that we're trying to find out. So are there particular categories of staff that may be more adversely affected than others? So is the job of work that some people do more dependent around the sort of age that they're in? So the sorts of things that are coming up is, well, you can imagine there's sort of heavy manual work that might be involved, in terms of the physical nature of that. So I've certainly been to conferences, and porters have said, look, Dean, I sort of log big oxygen bottles around up and down the corridors all day. I find it tough now. I don't really want to be doing that at 68. It's sort of one area. Go to another event and you say, ambulance staff saying, do you want someone driving at 68, at 90 miles an hour with blue lights flashing down the motorway? There's sort of issues there, or people that very precise sorts of skills in terms of coming in. And it's sort of easy to make sort of sweeping generalisations about that sort of coming in. But we wanted to have a look at, are there some sorts of issues that are more affected by that. And then what are the sort of options for looking about how we might fund some of that early retirement scheme? So a gentleman over here talked about you can access your pension at the moment. So we have this sort of actuarial reduction that if you retire earlier, you take a reduction in your pension because you're leaving earlier as a result of that. Are there changes to that we might make in terms of, employer funded elements of that? So, or employee funded elements of that? Is there some sort of schemes that we can come up with that says, well, I want to go. There was something in the final scheme that talked about in those last 3 years, so the 65 to 68 as being available then, but is that something that we want to have a look at? What are the strategies that employers want to put in to support people working longer? So if we've got that ageing workforce, how might that sort of come about? And what are the flexibilities that we can get around some of the sorts of pension schemes, opt in and out? What does it mean in terms of final salary scheme versus career average schemes? It'll affect people differently in different ways as they come along. So those are some of the sorts of things that we did it. We put, as you might expect, some sort of governance arrangements in place. So the negotiations on this issue take place through the Staff Council. We have a pension scheme group. We've got this Working Longer Review group, and they split up into two groups, one looking at the sort of evidence base and sort of collecting that, and the other looking at sort of the practical applications of that in the workplace. So it's all very well to get some academic report about what might be, but does that work in practice in the workplace? And then some of the sort of evidence, what sort of evidence that's out there, what do we need to get? So, to what extent does age impact on the ability to deliver care? Does it mean things for performance and productivity of people? What's the type of staff? What numbers might be affected? What's the sort of analysis we've got of that situation? And do different staffs exhibit different behaviours around this sort of issue? I was talking to someone earlier today and saying in my days as a sort of HR director, if there were two groups of staff that used to come and wanting to work, so when we had the 65 as you must retire, the employer could agree to keep people on belong that. And this is a sweeping generalisation, but broadly two groups of staff would come and see me and say that they want to stay on longer, consultants and domestics. Now, there were people in between those, but if I was sort of counting, those were the groups that wanted to stay on, maybe for very different reasons about how they wanted to do that, but those were the sorts of effects. So what's the sort of behaviours about people have in terms of how they work? So we did an audit of some of the existing research. You've got Bath University. I noticed there's some pamphlets on the back there if people want to sort of get hold of them. That's more comprehensive than this, but looking at the what's out there already that we've got. Some obvious sorts of things really, but for staff to remain productive in the workplace, and we need this sort of good fit between the demands of the job, the working environment, personal circumstances, and the motivation to continue to do the work. This sort of idea that people don't have sufficient awareness of the understanding of the options that might be available to people, and as I say, I guess there's a reasonable number of informed people in the room here. But when we're talking about what's the state retirement age, what's the age, pension age, what's it for men, what's it for women, what does it mean in terms of your birthday, it becomes more and more complex. And yet we've got sort of managers and staff, to what extent do they understand some of these options that might be available for them. So they got this, saying there's a striking lack of appropriate knowledge around these sorts of issues. And I guess this sort of call for a bit of a sort of cultural change about how we speak of retirement. So again, I'm sort of confessing some of my own ignorance around this issue, but from someone working in HR, if someone says retirement to me, I think they're coming to tell me they're about to leave, or they're giving me 3 or 6 months notice that they want to be leaving work. And we probably need to change this sort of idea that when people start talking about retirement, that we might be talking about a 5 or an 8 year sort of process for people doing that. So, if you just have a look at the sorts of things in terms of our understanding around this issue. So I've grown up 20 years or so in the NHS, and people talk about retirement. One of the things that you didn't want to do was in your last 3 years is reduce your earnings, because your pension was dependent upon the earnings in your last 3 years of work. On a career average scheme, that's less of an issue. So someone in the past that was saying, well, I can't drop down into a lower role, a lower paid role to do that because it will adversely affect my pension. Now if you're sort of moving down and it's a career average scheme, the impact on your pension just isn't anything like the same as it would have been, which could be significant for people coming in. And then those things about, well, what's the extent to, can I part retire and come back? Can I work part-time? So all those sorts of things, I think this sort of cultural change about the way that when we talk about retirement. So when someone says, I need to talk to you about retirement in the HR department, talk to their manager, you're not thinking, that's right, I need to give 3 months notice to the pension agency so you can get your pension on time. Thanks very much for telling me you're going to go on your birthday. different sorts of conversation, different sorts of issues coming forward. So this thing about line managers needing training to support and manage that, and again in the sort of multi-generational context about this. What we've also got is that older people, where they're sort of in good health and kept up to date, perform just as effectively as younger people. So again, some of the sorts of cultural understandings about how we might have got the ability of older people to do work. Again, sort of cultural change coming in. And what is it that we need to do to address some of those cultural challenges and misconceptions? So this sort of understanding, as I say, that we've all grown up with, and probably we're all sort of participants in that as well. We start talking about, I'm looking forward to this sort of point in my career so I can step down and don't have to do the work, and I can't keep up with this. There's a big sort of cultural change, I think, that needs to sort of take place around some of that. And then we had a look at the that was all very well in terms of the existing evidence, but where were the gaps for us? And so these are the some of the things. So nothing really specifically about the NHS. So some general sort of findings about age and retirement and working lives, but not very much about what does that mean into the NHS. What does a sort of a comprehensive, proactive HR occupational health function in the future look like? So again, back to that sort of cultural change about what we understand by sort of pension, retirement, all those sorts of issues. It's easy to say we need to train line managers, but is that just in the technical knowledge of age, retirement age, that sort of thing? What are the other sorts of issues in terms of this sort of multi-generational workplace that we go? And then what are the barriers to this flexible working around that? Some of that will be about preconceived ideas. Some of it will be about that sort of lack of appropriate knowledge about what's doable in there. But there's also sorts of things about the way that we see and do work and the way that we understand and rota work. So existing work about sort of approach to health and well-being strategies within the workplace. And again, I guess for those of us in HR, I think our approach to health and well-being has probably been dominated by reducing sort of sickness absence and creating a sort of better workplace. But again, if we look at in a bigger sort of context about what does health and well-being mean in the context of an ageing workforce and how we keep people sort of productive and motivated in the workplace, it's sort of different to something that might be driving us around sickness absence rate or the cost of sickness absence in that regard. But again, workplace design, sort of flexible working issues, etc. And again, we'll be publishing those findings later on this year. And then one of the sorts of things that we've said as part of that is to pilot this sort of idea as a big conversation. This is the very first one that we're doing in this. So we do need to get some sort of cultural changes sort of coming on around this. We do need some better knowledge and understanding about what the issues are around sort of pensions and pension ages, but we also need much better knowledge and working about what does it mean for managing and working with an ageing workforce into the future. So we're going to set up some more of these, but as this is the first one, as part of everything else that you do today, it would be great to get some sort of feedback on what's helpful or not helpful in these sorts of issues, what would have been helpful context setting for having the conversations. And we'll have a look about whether we roll these out in a sort of bigger way with more staff and that sort of thing across the country. But definitely the sort of opportunity to engage in this agenda. So that's me sort of coming to the end. It's more information you can get. We have a sort of Twitter account on this. That sort of as we're getting information, we're sort of putting it out with links to appropriate websites and information that you can follow. That's the NHS Working Longer Review website. We're putting stuff on our website at NHS Employers around this issue, and as I say, as we sort of analyse that information and bring it to the fore, we'll put it on there. But I suppose that most of all, what we're looking for is this has been the start of that sort of conversation where we start getting it more and more into the consciousness about this might not be the most urgent issue that people are talking about in the NHS at the moment, but it is probably the most important issue that we have to address over the next 10 or 15 years. And we've got to start that conversation now if we're to get that right as part of those changes that are taking place. So I hope that's been a sort of helpful context setting, but thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Laura.